Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today at this panel. How is this fight different from all other fights? A trans Jewish case for abolition. I'm Jamie Kavanah. My pronouns are they, them, or he, him. And my colleague Enzi Tanner and I are really excited to walk with you through the trans Jewish case for abolition. So let's start off with a quick look at our agenda. We are going to start with introductions and our community brit, or our agreements with one another, and then a grounding in Jewish learning. Next, we'll talk about why abolition is such an important issue for queer and Jewish communities. And then finally, we'll talk about some resources and the path forward, and then take questions and comments. So to get started, let's do some quick introductions. In the chat, please share your name, the pronouns you'd like us to use in this space if you're comfortable sharing them, and one space where you feel safety. And then I will pass it on to Enzi to set up our brit.
All right. Can you put the brit slide on, Jamie?
Yes, it is on its way.
All right. Okay, so with our brit, let me see what's on the page. So we're looking at three main principles for our brit: Shema, which is listening. Excuse my language. So Shema, which is listening. We will actively listen even when we hear challenging things. Kavod, or dignity. We recognize the dignity of all human beings and express our different viewpoints in a thoughtful manner without an insulting spirit. Elavelu, multiple voices. We value the multiplicity of voices within society and individuals. We will speak for ourselves. We will not ask others to represent, defend, or explain an entire group. We'll make I statements rather than we or our statements. And just an added reminder that the Jewish community is extremely diverse. And so when asking questions or if speaking about white assimilated folks, it's important to not assume that as Jews, we are all white assimilated. So yeah. And I didn't introduce myself. I apologize. My name is Enzi. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am the community safety organizer at Jewish Community Action. And I am a licensed social worker. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Enzi. So I am going to start us off with a quick grounding in some Jewish thought. As I'm sure will astonish all of you, I, an anxious trans Jew, really love my therapist. And one of the things she's taught me, for which I'm most grateful, is that my boundaries, which I sometimes think of as an inconvenience to other people or an obstacle to intimacy, are really a gift. We name our boundaries when we want to be able to stay in right relationship with someone. Naming when a boundary has been crossed and letting someone know when we've been hurt or threatened is hard and scary. Listening when someone else names that kind of violation is hard too. If we do it, it's because we're taking the leap of faith that our effort might yield results, that we may be able to heal our relationship with the person who harmed us or whom we have harmed. Something you should know about me is that I'm a baby Jew. I only started thinking of myself as Jewish about a year or so ago, and I'm still learning about new aspects of Judaism all the time. When I learned about the principle of tocheka, or loving rebuke, earlier this year, it really resonated with me. I want to share a quick quote from a piece on Sefaria by Jace Kuster called Teshuvah, Jewish Thought and Abolition. And in it, Jace defines tocheka as being from the root to be firm, to stand, or to be right. This is often translated as loving rebuke. We offer tocheka to help people see what they have done wrong and encourage them to do better. This is a community responsibility and one of the key ways that we show love to one another. To help each other do better is to show our love and care. And I am going to share a link to that piece in the chat just in case anyone's curious. Yeah, so when we work toward the cause of abolition, when we name and demand restitution for the ways in which prisons and policing have harmed us and our loved ones and our fellow community members, we're committing an act of love. We're saying to ourselves and each other, I believe that you can do better, and I need to see you try. It can feel intimidating and overwhelming, but the truth is that it's both our privilege and our responsibility to demand better systems from ourselves and each other. We have the tools we need to build better systems for our communities, and abolition is within our reach if we're brave enough to work for it. There's one more framing I want to share here, and then I will pass it on to Enzi. This is a quote that I first heard in a song by Ali Halpert, who's a wonderful Jewish musician who does a lot of work on SoundCloud. And the quote turns out to come from Arundhati Roy, but it says, "Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And I think that's true. I think that we have other options and they're so close and we can almost taste them. So I'll pass it on to Enzi to talk to us a little bit about how we get there.
Awesome. So first off, I want to say that we are grounding this conversation in abolition. And it's important to realize that this is a conversation that has been going on for decades. Even the conversation around defund the police did not just begin this summer. It has been rooted and it has been a struggle and a fight for a very, very long time. So we are going to watch a video that is a quick video describing the difference between reform, defund, and abolition. I want to do a quick disclaimer. The political views that this person might share in a quick second in the video is not the views of JCA. Yeah, so we'll watch this video, and then after that, we will have a quick conversation about anti-Blackness in order to have room for questions and answers. So.
I am running into a tiny tech issue with figuring out how to make the sound work, so I will do my best. This might take a second or two. Thanks for bearing with me.
While they work on trying to get the sounds, I do want to encourage folks, especially if we're not sure how much time we'll have at the end. If you have questions that you want to ask, feel free to shoot them in the chat. And just as a reminder, we will have our contact information because this is a very quick training. So if folks want more detailed information, you can reach out at the end. Jamie, how are you doing with sound?
I am getting there. I might have it in a second. Here we go. Got it. Okay.
We differentiate between abolishing. All right, baby, I think it's super important that we differentiate between abolishing, defunding, and reforming the police. Regardless of which action you support, let's just start by saying what we mean and not conflating ideas to make it more palatable for people. Let's start with reform. By and large, most people would agree that the criminal justice system ain't it. It's not perfect. Police reform looks to specifically introduce positive change to police conduct with things like more training, new technologies, so body cams, and community policing. The ideology behind police reform is that while the system isn't perfect, with enough focus and care, we can limit the ability of police officers to abuse their power or endanger the lives of the people they're supposed to protect. Now, this is different than the call to defund police because reforms are ultimately going to cost more money, incentivizing a larger budget for the police department. Whereas defunding the police calls for lowering the budget and reallocating those funds to support community health and public services. Those who want to defund the police believe that the more money police have, the more dangerous they become, which we can see in the way that many departments around the nation have become militarized without need, or how having more money to get more cops results in over-policing in poor neighborhoods. Where reformists allocate focus and care to the police departments, those who want to defund the police shift that focus and care to the community itself, hopefully lowering the need for police intervention and subsequently lowering opportunities for any abuse of power. Both of our current presidential prospects oppose the idea of defunding the police, but the movement has found more traction amongst local governance. Now, where defunding and abolishing the police part ways is in their end game. Most abolitionists would agree that the police should be defunded, but only as a means to an end, not as the end in itself. Abolishing the police means rejecting the idea that the police department can be altered or reformed in any meaningful way, even with a slash to the budget. Make sure you check out the work of organizations like Critical Resistance and Reclaim the Block to learn more about what abolitionists call reformist reforms, or reforms that constantly need to be revisited and reformed later on. But before we talk about the complexities of abolition, we need to first acknowledge that this is not a new conversation. For many of us, the abolition movement is only on our radar due to the current national spotlight on state-sanctioned killings of Black people by police. But people beyond this moment, specifically Black women, have been pointing us towards the goals of abolition for decades. Scholars and educators like Mariam Kaba, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mark Lamont Hill, Angela Davis, these are all people we should be listening to, following, learning from if we're new to the idea or if we have questions. But when we paint this as something new, then we create room for people to dismiss the entire movement as naive. Abolitionists believe that we should be focused on creating the conditions in which police are not needed in our society at all. Not one of them. And creating those conditions involves something I like to call the 3 Ds. The first D is defund, which we've already talked about as divesting from police and investing in community-driven programs that promote health and safety. Then we've got decentralize, which means redistributing the functions and responsibilities of the police to groups that are specifically trained in those areas. Currently, the police are expected to meet way too many public needs, from traffic stops to welfare checks to, in the case of George Floyd, the suspected use of counterfeit bills. Even the response to violent crimes can be the responsibility of a much smaller, specialized force. The third D is decriminalize, lowering the bar for what's considered a criminal offense. Things like sex work, drug use, homelessness, or vagrancy are criminal offenses that aren't inherently violent or unsafe, and with proper support and regulation can function without police intervention. That's just a few of the ways that abolitionists work to create the conditions that we need. The things like decarceration and restorative justice that also plays a huge part in what it means to be an abolitionist. But none of those steps or Ds should be mistaken for abolition itself. The goal of abolition is exactly as it states, to abolish the police. And if we're not clear on that goal, we can't ever get there. And if we're not as clear as possible about what we're doing, we run the risk of maybe dismantling and disbanding some police departments, but then creating a system that's just as harmful, or recreating police departments under a different name. It happened with the 13th Amendment and slavery, and it can happen again today. We also have to abolish the idea that the police exist to protect us. We've watched one too many cop shows and have created this collective mythos about who the police are and how they function in our society. We've had this trope about a few bad apples drilled into our minds, so now whenever the institution is challenged, we can't help but retreat and protect the individuals that are associated with it. For abolition movements across history, the biggest barrier has always been a lack of imagination. Some of us, though, have never had these illusions, or had them dispelled really early through consistent interactions with an institution with police that sought to brutalize, violate, and scapegoat our communities. But what else is to be expected from an organization that finds its origin in the early 1700s as slave patrol, later evolving into segregation enforcement and keeping freed slaves in check? Police have always existed to protect property over people. They've always protected each other over the communities that they were there to serve. At this point, we're done with them failing us. So if you're an abolitionist, say it proudly. Don't water down the movement to appease the sensibilities of people you think might not understand. And if you're not an abolitionist and you identify more with defunding or reforming the police, say it with your chest. Stop co-opting abolition when you're not actually about that life. That does a disservice to everyone. The clearer we are, the easier it is to move forward.
So that was a lot in that video, and we will drop the video in the chat. We wanted to share that video particularly One, as a resource, if you are trying to have this conversation with folks, but two, to root the conversation, one, in abolition, but two, also to make it give as much information as possible with the limited time we have. Like I said, that was really, really fast. One of the things that I really appreciated or that was highlighted in this video is the origins of the police. And I just want to say a few things first. One, part of this conversation I'm about to have is a conversation about intersectionality. And what I mean by intersectionality is referring to people or individuals who hold multiple identities. And when Kimberly Crenshaw coined the phrase of intersectionality, it was really looking at it from a legal standpoint and thinking about how folks who may be Black and hold other identities, whether it's queer, disabilities, etc., how those interact and impact the experiences that people have. So first I want to say the LGBT rights movement, the gay rights movement, the queer movement began as a protest and an uprising against police brutality. That's how it began. And so that's important as we look at our history, particularly as trans folks, right? Because trans folks, since the beginning of time, have been fighting and pushing against police brutality and trying to figure out how do we stay safe. And those are very, very important. So as we talked about earlier, and as the person in the video shared, the policing system in the United States in many ways has its origins in the slave patrols. And that's really important to understand. Also, as he said earlier, the 13th Amendment makes slavery legal, illegal except in the punishable by crime, i.e. prisons. And so I say that because it's really important to combine the conversation of prison abolition with police abolition. If police officers are catching or looking for people and bringing them from one place to prison, it's the same similar situations as we have with the history of slave patrols. Another major piece about anti-Blackness when it comes to policing that's important to understand is two political pieces. In the 80s, when Reagan made a lot of changes and shifting, it started to, around that time, we started using dog whistle language. And what I mean by dog whistle language is language that is racially motivated without using racial language. Language like thugs instead of calling people the N-word, etc. And so around that time, people started to become more and more aware and nervous about quote unquote crime in communities, etc. And so people started to push for more policing. Skip decade, get 1994. And this is really important to how we see policing now. Underneath President Clinton, they passed the 1994 Act, which drastically increased policing in communities. And when I say drastically, it was over 100,000 police officers added to the force from the federal government. And in this time, communities of color, particularly Black communities, were extremely over-policed. You have the times where people, that's where racial profiling became really huge. And so now we're in a time period where we are, I'm bad at math, so we're in 2021, which is however many years after 1994. But many of us have not seen a time where policing was not just everywhere and where it wasn't just assumed as something that's happening. Quick disclaimer, I had my second shot of vaccine yesterday, and so I am a little out of it. That's why I'm kind of up and down. So I should have said that from the beginning. Thank you. I don't know why I said that because that threw me off. Okay, sorry, I do apologize about that. The biggest other thing that I want to bring up or say is thinking about when we think about abolition and anti-Blackness and the roots of abolition, the roots of policing, it is important to think about not just the history, but also what do we do next and how do we move forward and what is possible. In many ways, when I think of this conversation of policing and community safety, I really think about it in many ways. It's Passover, right? So in many ways, I think of it as Pharaoh's army is right behind us, and in front of us, we're right at the sea, right? And we have these choices or opportunities to cross over, but we have no clue what it's going to be like. We don't know what's on the other side. We haven't, and in fact, at this point, the river hasn't even crossed, hasn't even, opened. And so how do we navigate? How do we deal with this anxiety and fear? Because we don't know what's next. And with that, what I want to kind of encourage us is like Naksham, who made that first step into the sea. How do we figure out what the next steps are? How do we do that? How do we create a police-free world or a world that is safe, even if there is a world with policing? And with that, I want to say that abolition is not about absence, it's about presence. Abolition is about building life-affirming institutions. That is a quote by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And I say that because really wanting to think about how do we build these systems? Like how do we build life-affirming institutions, and what can they look like? And so I'm going to hand it off to Jamie so we could talk a little bit. I think Jamie's next. So we could talk a little bit about how JCA started this conversation, and what this is, how we navigate this conversation in the middle of the uprising after the murder of George Floyd.
Thanks so much, Enzi. Yeah, so as I realize I'm not sure I've mentioned before, Enzi and I are both community organizers at Jewish Community Action in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Or actually, it's located in St. Paul, but I believe we're both in Minneapolis right now. That work from home life. But anyway, so during the uprising in Minneapolis this summer, we got to see firsthand what it can look like, or one example of what it can look like when community comes together to make a big push for abolition. And Enzi was not on staff at JCA yet at that time. I was, but he joined very shortly after. And so what that process looked like was in the initial, couple of weeks of the uprising, we started off with many people feeling very naturally drawn to a lot of mutual aid type activities. And JCA is not a direct service organization, but it seemed ludicrous not to be bringing our community with us if we could and helping do things like clean up in the streets or work with food distributions, and things like that. So there was some amount of mutual aid work at first. But what happened after that was that we started to realize that we had this incredible moment in which we had the opportunity to move a lot of our base. So JCA organizes Jews and allies in the Twin Cities and in the rest of the state of Minnesota, and sometimes beyond. Many of our members are white Jews. Some of our members are Jews of color. And overall, we have many members who I think are friendly to the idea of abolition, but haven't necessarily have all different levels of knowledge and awareness on the issue. And so what made it really possible for us to figure out where to plug our members in and where to help guide them was that we were already in relationship and coalition with a bunch of orgs led by especially Black leaders and other Indigenous leaders and leaders of color in the area. And so what happened was, because we were already in coalition relationships with orgs like Reclaim the Block or Black Visions, or like, I am now suddenly drawing a blank, but there are many orgs. because we already had those relationships and that base built, it was easier for us than it would have been otherwise to say, okay, where can we plug in? How can we support? We have already built trust and established relationships. Now, how do we determine precisely what our lane is? And that has been a really powerful and interesting thing to witness and experience. And so from my experience this past summer, from our experience at JCA, I would say that the pathway, if you want to start working on abolition or continue working on abolition in your community, is if you're not already talking to your local abolitionist orgs, start. There are probably BIPOC-led abolitionist orgs in your area. And by that, I mean organizations led by Black folks, Indigenous folks, and other people of color. It's good to take their lead, especially if you're new to the issue. You really want to spend a lot of time learning and listening. And finally, figure out what your niche for influence is and work with your specific audience on abolition, following the lead of the orgs that are already doing it. As Enzi and I were talking about this yesterday, and I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, Enzi, one thing he mentioned to me was that we need to aim to be in solidarity with each other, not just in response to trauma, but all the time. We need to be in relationship with each other so that when a traumatic or potentially destabilizing event occurs, we can be really well prepared to show up for each other and to support each other. So yeah, that is my story of how things went this past summer. So let's talk a little bit about where to go if you have questions. The number one resource that we would recommend for this is defundthepolice.org. It is really rich and useful. It is full of lots of really helpful information. I will drop a link in the chat as well. And then I think we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule, which is great.
I do want to add a little bit about next steps.
Go for it, Enzi. Yes.
Sorry. So several things. So one, this training, we put this together kind of hopefully so you could use some of the resources that we offered as a way to have this conversation with your folks. So we didn't really go into a lot of details about abolition, etc. But what I name is with our communities, it doesn't have to be about abolition if your community is not there and ready for that yet. As we're having this conversation with our base, we're starting the conversation around community safety as a whole. And it's intentional, and part of it is allowing for leaders to be a part of this movement who may not actually be ready to have the abolition conversation. And really the goal is community safety. The goal is to have a place where we can all be safe and secure and know how to navigate through the world, right? The goal is to be able to show up to high holy days and not be harassed by police officers. And so the goal is figuring out how do we create these systems together. And in Minneapolis, we're doing a lot of different things and coalitions, which is very, very exciting. So now we have time for questions. And yeah, if folks want to maybe raise their hand, or I'm not sure, we have room for like maybe 2 or 3 questions. You can also put it in the chat if you need to.
I have a question, which is if you could talk a little bit about restorative justice processes when someone in your community commits harm, because that's something a lot of my communities have struggled with, of how to do this through an abolitionist framework, but support the person who has been harmed.
Such a great question. So what I would say is this is a question that at least we have been struggling with. And one of the things that we're doing at JCA, and this is focused on masculine folks, but we're holding a toxic masculinity group. And as we do that, we're actually looking at what are the resources and working through a workbook together on restorative justice and what different processes can be. So what I would say is it's complex because for me, at least, a huge piece of restorative justice, transformative justice is about having established relationships and community. And so that's just a quick answer. There's a lot to it, and much more like really looking at what do we, how do we look at restorative justice, right? Because for me, this conversation as a Jew is how do we repair harm? And what happens when someone is harmed and how do we navigate through that? And that's the question that is asked about restorative justice. And that is something that I hope that we could figure out and work through, because we haven't, I don't think we've done a great job of that as a community as a whole. Yes. On which topic are you referring to? Are you referring to abolition as a whole, or? So I have a few books. One book is a must that if you haven't read, Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. It's a very, very short book. Another book that just came out that I'm very excited about is We Do This Till We Free Us. Miriam Kaba, Abolitionists, Organizing and Transforming Justice. This book is really great. It covers abolition, police, and prisons. Perfect, thank you. And then the final book is, I will actually put the final book in the chat, but it's a book, another book by Miriam Kaba, which is a workbook working through restorative justice and transformative justice questions. So.
I'm wondering about, I am a young person and I'm a part of a conservative synagogue and I am a Reform Jew. And so I have been struggling with a lot lately. A lot of the people hold a lot more power than me because I'm young. And a lot of people in my community hold more conservative views on abolition. And I'm wondering how I can combat the system while recognizing that the community that I'm a part of isn't going to be on board with that right away. I recognize the work that I need to do and I'm ready to do it, but I don't know how to live in the system and fight the system at the same time. And I was wondering if you had any ideas on that.
So yes, and that's a very long question. So first off, I want to say, make sure you get my email address so we can have a further conversation about this, if that's helpful. But one I will say is, for me, we have not had much conversations at JCA about abolition. I've been holding conversations about community safety. And that's because the conversation on abolition is a scary conversation for some people. There's lots of pushbacks, lots of questions. How do we navigate this? And so for me, it's just important to be able to figure out like, what is the beginning conversation and how do we start it? Because in many ways, I've told people that the conversation around policing is a lot like the Talmud. We have some folks who, like, there's all different types of ways, and there's not necessarily one right way. I'm an abolitionist. I'm not going to hide that. I'm a proud abolitionist. I think that policing and prisons need to be getting rid of. I have had extreme negative reactions and interactions with the police simply for just standing in front of my house. And I think that it takes all of our community to get to where we're at. And so the biggest piece I would say is not pushing for folks, like holding true in like what your standards are, if it's an abolition, but not pushing and expecting our community to all be on the same page with that. Hopefully that helps.
I wonder if I can add one small thing to that. In my experience, especially if the power holders in your community are white folks, I think it can be really helpful to ask people to think about their actual interactions with police and how helpful they actually were. Because I think a lot of the time for people who don't have many interactions with police because of being, if they're white, if they're middle or upper class, like if they have the markers that give you buffers of protection from police, sometimes people have this idea that police must be useful, but then if they think about their actual interactions, if they think about the time that their car got broken into or the time that they had to talk to a cop about XYZ, a lot of the time they will realize that, as a matter of fact, it wasn't that useful, it wasn't that helpful, it was a negative experience. That isn't true of everyone all the time, but I think that it can be helpful to say, like, tell me what problems you think police solve, and then tell me if you've ever seen them actually solve them.
And another way to do that is, there's a activity that I often do with folks, and it's really thinking about an incident or an issue that the police are often called for to solve. And then in thinking about the issue, coming up with other ways to solve that issue and looking at, are there better ways to navigate through this and to deal with this? And especially folks who are extremely pro-police, one way that I've had this conversation is saying, yo, there's so much that our community could do without the police. And as we call them to deal with quote unquote smaller issues, that prevents them from dealing with the issues in which they're trained to deal with. And so sometimes it's important to look at it as, sometimes when we have this conversation, we have to figure out how to meet those, how to meet folks where they're at with the conversation in order to find some type of common ground, if that makes sense. Do we want to put that last slideshow so folks can have the our emails and everything else?
Absolutely, I can do that. I'm also realizing when Enzi and I were planning this, we thought that we had 45 minutes, and I realize now I think we actually have 50. So if there's another question or two, go ahead.
Yes, please. I was going fast because I thought we had 3 minutes left. Can someone read that question? Jamie, if you could read that question to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see two different questions that have just come up. Raquel Silverman says, sorry to ask another question. Please don't apologize. This is great. But I'm wondering if you can speak to anti-Semitism in the role for desire for safety, specifically policing in Jewish spaces and intergenerational trauma's role in that, etc. And then there is another question from Uriah, but do you want me to pause first?
Yeah, pause first. So such a great question. I will try not to go on a tangent about that because I'm very passionate about it. So first, I will say that there are resources, especially after the Tree of Life shooting, where communities figured out some resources. One of the things that happened was community members trained allies in de-escalation and they did security for the space. So I want to start off with that, and the question around trauma, or the question around intergenerational histories and trauma, etc. So I will say, for me, I use the language of white assimilated Jews when I'm talking about white appearing Jews. And part of that is about trauma, particularly as I look at even as it relates to anti-Blackness in the Jewish community. And what I mean by that is thinking about, one, in the late 60s, we have a lot of radical Black movements, and those radicals were being taken and murdered by the government. This is very shortly after, shortly as in, decades after the Holocaust. So what do you do when you are seeing your closest quote unquote allies being disappeared or murdered by the government? The other aspect is there's a level of trauma that has, particularly folks, folks and grandparents, that generation, where they don't talk about the trauma experienced. And because of the lack of talking about it, many folks might not be aware of where concerns and where some trauma reactions come from with that. I could talk a lot about it, and that's a much longer role and much longer conversation. But what I will say is anti-Semitism has always been used as a buffer, and as Jews have been used as a scapegoat between communities of color and other marginalized communities, and has been put in this really unfair situation. We have a coworker who does white nationalism and anti-Semitism conversations, and we're working on a joint presentation to talk about anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness and the role of policing. So this is a great question, but it's a seminar response.
In our last couple of minutes, we've had some other great questions come up in the chat. And Enzi, I'm thinking you might be really well equipped to answer, especially the last one. So from Uriah, we have one that says, I'm sure a lot of folks here do know about this, but could y'all speak more on the history of policing and trans folks, as there may be folks here who aren't as familiar, about why abolition is specifically a trans issue? I'm thinking about transness and policing, especially as it becomes criminal to give trans kids medical care in Arkansas. The criminalization even extends beyond us to doctors, teachers, etc. We need solidarity where folks will examine policing, prison, and criminalization, and taking steps towards solidarity that have just been made illegal. And then from Mark and Mirel, we have an additional question added on to that about the criminalization of trans youth and abuse in the foster system.
Yeah, so I have to figure out how to answer really, really fast. Let me look at, okay, transness. So what I would say is a big piece of this, we have like a big part of this question, right, is what is reminding us or thinking about what is criminalized, right? What is considered illegal or what is considered wrong. And oftentimes we can look at those issues and see that there are a lot of just unfair pieces. And so when it comes to our trans youth, et cetera, like I think this is one reason, especially as more and more things are becoming criminalized, how do we then build solidarity with other communities that have been constantly criminalized as we deal, because many folks are doing decriminalizing programs together. And so in some of those places, it might be really good to get connected with other groups, i.e., or for example, one of the coalitions that we work with is the Sex Workers Coalition. And it's important that we work with them because they're a community that have often been criminalized. And a lot of sex workers also happen to be trans-identified or trans youth. And so it's really, for me, it's about figuring out the common grounds as well as navigating through or remembering that this is an important issue. When we think about how if I was to do a workshop and think about how we call the police or how do we navigate that, adding people's identities is important, right? Because calling the police on a Black trans man could get him murdered in a second. And there's so much more involved in it. And we have 1 minute, so.
Yeah, I know we have to wrap up, but I wanted to say thank you all for these questions. They're really interesting and fruitful, and I hope you've benefited from us talking about them. Wish we could talk about them a little more. Do feel free to contact us if you'd like, and thank you so much to our interpreters and tech support, Jennifer, Julián, Noah, and Ruth, I think.